This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider Video Interview, I have three experts on the life and career of American playwright Eugene O'Neill, and we will spend the next hour or two talking about his career, his life, his influences, and his impact on American theater. And we'll do that in a moment. All right, let's get right into it. And before we get into Eugene O'Neill, let me just introduce the three panelists, and then I'll let each of them take a couple of minutes to tell of themselves and their relationship and interest in the works of Eugene O'Neill. If you are looking from left to right on your screen, you will see Beth Winstra, Katie Johnson, and Stephen Bloom. So Beth, let me start with you. If you could take a couple of minutes and just tell a little bit about yourself and what your interests and specialties are in regard to Eugene O'Neill.
Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having us here. I should say that my interest in O'Neill really began during my high school years because I grew up just about 10 miles away from Dow House, which is the location where O'Neill wrote his greatest and late plays, including Long Day's Journey into Night and A Moon for the Misbegotten, The Iceman Cometh. So I knew of Dow House, and in fact, my mother was on the board at Dow House, and so I was introduced at a young age. And during my college years, I began taking workshops at Dow House and soon began teaching some workshops about O'Neill and his work at Dow House. So when I started graduate school, I had, certainly an introduction to O'Neill, but I became very interested particularly in the women in his plays and how the women in his plays perhaps mirrored or were similar to the women in his life. So that's what kind of began my research, investigating the women in his life and in his works. When I became an assistant professor at Babson College in Massachusetts, I joined the O'Neill Society, of which I now serve as secretary and treasurer. And the society has the aim of supporting works of O'Neill both on the stage and on the page, enhancing scholarship and educating the next generation of O'Neill scholars. And I'm certainly very interested not only in the women in his works, that's my primary research focus, but also bringing in the next generation of O'Neill scholars to learn about his works.
And I'm just looking at an email you sent me. You're working on a book about courtship, engagement, and marriage in O'Neill's works?
Yes, I am. I'm looking at all kind of, forms of relationships from early courtship, engagement, and then marriage in his plays. So that's the project that's underway right now.
And for the uninitiated, you mentioned Dow House. What exactly is that? Is that like an organization that supports young playwrights or what?
So Dow House actually was the name that O'Neill and his third wife, Carlotta, gave to their residence. It's in Danville, California, and that is where the two of them lived, and where, like I mentioned, O'Neill wrote his greatest works. Dow House is now a national park site. It's actually the only national park dedicated to an American playwright. And so visitors can go and see where O'Neill created these masterpieces. There's a great foundation attached to Dow House, which supports educational initiatives. There are performances that happen on the site. But yeah, Dow House was the name that O'Neill and his wife Carlotta gave to the residents, mainly because of Carlotta's interest in Eastern philosophy and religion.
I'm
sure we'll talk more about Dow House as we get to that stage of his life, certainly.
I was hoping there's going to be sort of like Robinson Jeffers, the poet, in Tor House, and some big rock thing.
Beth, didn't they also build it with the money from the Nobel Prize?
Yes. Yeah, the $40,000 that O'Neill won for the Nobel Prize is what built that house. Yeah.
Okay. Katie, I'm looking at some information on you, and you're also write and are interested in race and sex in O'Neill. But before you get onto that, just tell a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, nice to be University of Ohio, and I sort of think of myself as an accidental O'Neillian who sort of stumbled upon him, of course, kind of like Beth, and I imagine Steve, you know, had, of course, read him and hoped to perform him one day as a high school student, and you know, had seen that memorable production of Long Day's Journey into Night with Philip Seymour Hoffman and Vanessa Redgrave and Brian Dennehy, and it just ignited something in me. But as a graduate student, I was my dissertation and which turned into my first book was about representations of sexuality in early 20th century American drama, and specifically the representation of prostitution. And so I came to O'Neill because he features prostitutes in something like 20 or more of his plays, and of course there's some personal history regarding prostitution as well. And so I started writing about his play Anna Christie, which garnered him his second Pulitzer Prize, and I just really became introduced to O'Neill, attended my first O'Neill conference. And I believe it was in France, where he lived for some time. And I just became hooked in learning more about O'Neill, writing more about O'Neill. And now I teach every other year, and sometimes every year, a seminar dedicated to O'Neill, which I call Eugene O'Neill in Context, because I like to situate him among some of the other writers during that time period, some of the Provincetown players. And they're starting to write about O'Neill. So that's the thing about O'Neill. Once you start working on him, you kind of can't let go.
I also see that it says that you are involved in performances of O'Neill on the London stage. So are you more of a dramaturg or an academic? Are you actually involved in producing, putting stuff on the stage then?
I've been more working behind the scenes. I've reviewed some of these productions, and for one of the productions at the Donmar Warehouse, I was lucky enough to talk to some of their audiences before the production, and Ruth Wilson, who were in that play. And I wrote the program notes for the playbill, so very much kind of as a scholar and fan of O'Neill, I guess we could say.
Okay, well, let me move on to Steve Bloom, our third participant. And in looking at the information you had sent, it says that you have an interest in existentialism within O'Neill's plays, as well as the family dynamics. Why don't you just tell a little bit first of who you are, and then maybe a little bit on those areas.
Okay, well, you actually missed the beginning of that, which is the my focus on alcoholism and intoxication, which I'll tell you really how I came to O'Neill, not through my own intoxication. I actually, my love of drama really began long ago, but got firmly rooted when in high school, where I went to the School of Performing Arts in Manhattan, and at that time I was going to be an actor, but moved in other directions towards studying drama and theater, and I knew didn't head in that direction until grad school. What happened was I wrote a senior thesis in college on Edward Albee, who was the hot new American playwright back in 1972, 73. And when I went to graduate school, I had this interest through my work on Albee in his use of drinking and alcoholism. And of course, as I read more American drama and American literature for that matter, there was tons of intoxication and alcoholism, and I became interested in that as an aspect of American drama, which led me to the granddaddy of them all, O'Neill. So I wrote my dissertation on O'Neill's use of alcoholism and intoxication as a dramaturgical device, particularly in his late plays. And then published parts of that dissertation in various publications and presented at several conferences. And around 1984, about 83, I met Fred Wilkins, who was at the at Suffolk University at the time. I was here in Boston at Emmanuel College, and I got involved. He was organizing the first International O'Neill Conference here in Boston, and I got involved with helping him with that. He was one of the founders of the O'Neill Society and the founding editor of the Eugene O'Neill newsletter, which became the Eugene O'Neill Review. I later became the book review editor of the Review for many years, and became a member of the board of directors of the O'Neill Society. I was president of the board in, I think, 2006, 2007, and I'm currently the chairman of the board of directors. And as Beth said, you know, that the commitment of the board to really spreading the word and public interest in O'Neill has really been part of my focus over the years. In addition to my work on alcoholism and intoxication, I more recently have published 2 books, one, A Student Companion to Eugene O'Neill, and the other called Critical Insights, Eugene O'Neill, which are both really meant to be kind of guides and handbooks for college students, upper level, high school students, and the general public in understanding and appreciating O'Neill. And I've spoken at theaters, done a lot of talkbacks at theaters. So I think here in Boston, and although I don't teach as much anymore in my administrative role here at LaSalle College in Newton, outside of Boston, when I do teach, I do a lot of courses that do focus on O'Neill and the family dynamics. I've done a course for in our retirement community here at LaSalle on the parent-child relationship in American drama, and focused a lot on O'Neill and others as well.
Well, before we get talking about who Eugene O'Neill was, let me just throw this out, since I saw that you had mentioned absurdism. As a layman, but someone who's read a lot of playwrights, I've got just right to my right here a couple of shelves full of plays from everyone from Aeschylus onward. It seems to me, and the reason I wanted to do a show on O'Neill first before any other playwrights is, I think of all the playwrights I've read, I think he's the greatest playwright, at least published. There may be some guy in Bulgaria who's better, but that we don't know of. But and I say that not to diminish the classical stuff, and not to diminish Shakespeare, but I don't think until you get to modernism do you really get the complexity and the depth of the human psyche. I mean, the closest I think Shakespeare came to is maybe Iago, but he's still dealing with basically stereotypes and caricatures and archetypes. Whereas when you get to Strindberg and Ibsen and then Shaw and O'Neill in this country, it seems to me this is really when, if someone is looking back, say in the year 2500 or 3000, this is when playwriting and theater, it really takes off with that set of people. Would you all agree in general with that?
Well, I think there are a lot of Shakespeare scholars who would take issue with your assessment of Shakespeare and his insight into human behavior. I think the difference that you're talking about is the move in modern times to, real people. That, Shakespeare was writing about, mostly he had his other his subplot characters, but mostly writing about royalty and so forth. And O'Neill was, among those playwrights. Ibsen and Strindberg, of course, preceded him, but O'Neill was the first American to bring drama and especially tragedy to the level of the common person, and into the living room, the sitting rooms of normal American people, and into bars and brothels and so forth.
Well, and it was a time period when, the American stage at that time period had really nothing. I mean, it was very sort of, we call it lowbrow.
Ben-Hur.
Yeah, exactly. And, with 10 horses on a track, or, these big melodramas that would, they would fill theaters with water. That, there were naval melodramas. I mean, there were genres of this schlock, which now is very sort of parallel to reality TV. And that's what the US stage was, or it was vaudeville, right? Working class theaters. And so we really didn't have anybody. And so as they were trying to elevate the theater in the US, they would bring in imports, right? They would bring in Shakespearean actors, and there were rivalries, right, between Edwin Forrest and his British contemporary, or they were doing Ibsen, and we were desperate for someone who could write. And so O'Neill not only had an ear for the American vernacular, and he was the grand experimenter, right? He did Norwegian and Scandinavian and Irish immigrant voices, African-American voices. But then he elevated it to this, within the realm of modernism by doing all of this experimenting with not so much absurdism, but expressionism. And, every play was a different experiment in many ways. And he then also tried to model on the Greeks and have it be more epic. And he was really, I think, searching and achieved, for lack of a better word, sort of greatness in the art form.
I also, should say that O'Neill, of course, was very well versed in his Shakespeare and in the Greeks, as Katie mentioned. I mean, his father, of course, was a famed Shakespearean actor before he went the way of melodrama. But, so in O'Neill, we have this, certainly a wide knowledge and an understanding of those who came before him, and then him creating works specifically for the American stage and the American people. And particularly what Katie mentioned, his desire to bring back tragedy as the Greeks understood it, not something that's just depressing and sad, but something that's meant to be exalting and exhilarating, I think is really a noble pursuit. I mean, certainly in his early plays, I don't think he achieved those ambitions, but definitely in the later plays, we see a whole new kind of notion of tragedy, one that had not been seen certainly in this country before O'Neill.
And speaking of melodramas, what was the melodramatic warhorse that his father James was always in?
The Count of Monte Cristo.
I was wondering whether it was Ben-Hur, but no, okay. So
it was just to add, there was a critic, I can't recall who it is at this moment, who said that before O'Neill there was American theater, and after O'Neill there was American drama.
Yes.
That's probably a good distinction. So since I mentioned his father, if one or all of you might want to just give a little bit of a 3 or 4 minute capsule for people who are really ignorant, or for young students who want to cheat on their latest essays that they need to write. So what we know, his father was a well-known actor, and in Long Day's Journey into Night, one of his final plays, most of that plays out. But his mother, was his mother an artist as well?
I would say certainly not in the the big commercial sense that his father was, but his mother actually was a very talented piano player. And although she, as a young girl, never had aspirations of being on the stage, or she actually had aspirations of being a nun, and that would soon change when she met James O'Neill. But I would the artistry, I think, is there in her piano playing, certainly, but it was her husband who was, yes, the money making artist in that family.
Were the O'Neills hobnobbing with other artists like the Mary Cassatt's or other people of that ilk, the Ambroses, Biases, those people of the late 19th century? Or were they bohemians, would you say?
Well, he certainly spent a good time, not in the late 19th century, but early 20th century, when he spent time in Greenwich Village, and particularly with the group that became the Provincetown Players, and of course the John Reed group, and that whole group that's depicted in the movie Reds. O'Neill's role with that group. So certainly he as a young man, he was part of that group and that culture in Greenwich Village.
And did
Provincetown.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, his father was, I try to tell my students, he's a little bit like maybe Patrick Stewart, right? Or someone like, Patrick Stewart's kind of great, who was a great Shakespearean actor. I'm talking about James O'Neill, Eugene O'Neill's dad, and who kind of, got on board instead of Star Trek. This popular vehicle, it was the Count of Monte Cristo, and he could not shake that beast off his back. And yet he was very handsome. He had a lot of women, I think, admirers. And poor Mary, I think she hated the theater in many ways. Back to your question of artistry. And she was, because of the gender norms at the time, the supporting spouse, right? And though she had the musical talent, that was not just really something that she could do. And I think she wanted to have some space from that because, doing the circuit, traveling in those hotel rooms, hanging out with actors who were perhaps partying, back to the alcoholism theme, it was not a great time for her. And so that tension was always, should I travel with my husband? Should I stay at home? And indeed, one of the tragedies that befell the family was when she did decide to go and be with him when one of the sons was ill, and then he became sick with measles, wasn't it? And wasn't she away at the time? And by the time she came back, and this is the story embedded in Long Day's Journey into Night, he was already so ill that he died. So I think for her, it was a very vexed relationship.
And, we should mention that, James O'Neill would play that role, the Count of Monte Cristo, over 6,000 times. So, this was, as Katie says, something he could not shake, and he did try, but he would continue. That's what audience wanted to see him in. So this was, it was certainly the major money maker in his career, but as that beautiful monologue in Long Day's Journey into Night reveals, it ruined him artistically because he couldn't go back to what he had done previously, which was beautiful work in Shakespeare. So
one of the interesting things about his father, though, is that was part of O'Neill, which we talked about before. Part of the change that O'Neill brought about in the theater had to do with his own personal rebellion against his father and his father's theater. So it's an interesting, as all of O'Neill is, this interesting mix between his artistry and his personal psychology and his own family issues. So he really wanted to change his father's theater. And of course, what's interesting is that there's a lot of melodrama in O'Neill's plays too. Even though he changed it, he still had a lot of the features that he learned at his father's knee.
Now, I'm seeing that some of his earliest plays date to the 19-teens, and O'Neill was born in what, 1889?
1888, right?
88. Okay. So when did he go on his sort of Herman Melville quest to the sea? When was that in the...
That was in 1912. Well, before 12, 10, 11.
10, I think.
10, 11, I think, because 12 is the year of his suicide attempt.
So right before then, yeah.
Before that, yeah.
Okay, and so was there a change? Did he look at himself as a failure, and then this going to sea, did this sort of catalyze him and propel him towards where he was going to end up, do you think?
It actually, well, in terms of his writing career, he's going to certainly use the experiences that he had on the sea in many of his plays, particularly the early plays. But in terms of becoming this artist and determined to change the American stage and become this playwright, that actually is not going to happen for a couple more years after the sea voyages, when he would contract tuberculosis and be spending some time in a sanatorium. And it was then that he was reflecting certainly on his father's theater, on these experiences he had on the sea. He was reading a great deal. And it was then that he had that ambition and that dream to pursue a career in playwriting that was going to be different than what had come before him. It was at this time, I think, he had that famous quote, "I want to be an artist or nothing." So always dramatic, that O'Neill, but you know that the artistic desire is going to come after those.
So he gets back from his world travels, and did he use any of his family connections to help get his stuff produced, or did he just wing it alone by himself? And how did he get involved in the Bohemian and get his first stuff produced?
Well, didn't his father assist with the publication of those first three plays?
Yeah.
Thirst and other plays. So, so he did have connections to publish those some of those early one acts, which were not among his best writing. But then again, no one was really writing good plays except for probably Susan Glaspell, I would say. And you know, it's worth saying, going back to the voyage, he did leave his first wife and child, right? He got on a boat and you know, he's kind of fleeing some of his early life choices as well. But then he does come back and he realizes something is going on at Provincetown and wants to be a part of it. And that's where everybody is. And it's, like you said, John Jack Reed and Susan Glaspell and Neith Boyce and Max Eastman, you know, the intellectuals of the village were there as well. And they were just experimenting and writing and putting on each other's plays, starring in them, directing them, doing, you know, kind of bad costumes, and you know, in a shack at first on the beach, and it was just a very kind of raw experimentation that I think was decidedly anti-commercial. If you've read the manifesto for the Provincetowners that John Reed wrote, it's fire over delicacy. It's about really, it's very radical and fresh. And he wanted to be a part of that, and he was a part of that.
Yeah, I read most of his early plays many years ago, and I'm just holding up that you can see. I have here the Sean O'Casey plays. It seemed to me that did O'Casey have any kind of influence on the early one acts? I mean, it seems to me he wasn't as good in the Irish kind of vernacular and humor that O'Casey was, but it seemed to me that O'Casey seemed to be a springboard that he then later jumped here, there, and everywhere from. I don't know. Has anyone ever made that connection? I don't know. No.
Well, there's definitely an influence of O'Casey, and O'Neill was certainly enamored with Irish theater, and you know, and so he was influenced by Irish theater in general, and I think that there have been several connections established between some of O'Casey's work and O'Neill's for sure.
And certainly the Abbey Theater, that was very influential when they toured the U.S. because they were doing something, from Dublin, they were doing something that really no one in the U.S. was doing, and that very much caught his attention.
And I'll say that touring production that Katie just mentioned, I mean, that was not only an influence to O'Neill, but to this group of Provincetowners, you know, in terms of what they wanted for the American theater. So, you know, I think there's a direct line there of some of those Irish masters to what then would happen later in this country.
But again, what's interesting, to go back to your earlier question, is that O'Neill's entrance into American theater is decidedly without his father's help.
Yeah.
I mean, he went into that aspect of American theater that was not his father's theater. That was, as Katie said, this non-commercial, experimental, you know, very kind of radical group that his father had nothing to do with. In fact, he was what they were rebelling against.
Yes. And what's funny, you know, James O'Neill actually will come at some point later to direct one of his son's plays, and it ends up being a complete disaster because James O'Neill's style of acting and theater is very different than what his son is attempting to do, right? So I think it was Before Breakfast, which was an early one act of Eugene O'Neill's, and his father attempted to help and give direction, and it just was, you know, not a good thing because they were so at odds, the two styles of theater.
And I think when he did get to see Beyond the Horizon, for which O'Neill won his first Pulitzer, and I think his father's comment was, "What are you trying to do? Send the audience home to kill themselves?"
Yes.
Well, I was going to actually my next question was going to be about Beyond the Horizon because that did win the first Pulitzer Prize. Uh, Off the top of my head, I don't recall what that one was about, but were there any plays before that you or other people have considered a turning point, or did that sort of just come out of nowhere because, qualitatively then if it, you know.
What I think is fascinating, and I'm sure this is the case with many artists, but with O'Neill, even those early one-act plays, which might not stand up as some of his greatest works today, what's fascinating when you read them is that you do begin to see, even in the very early plays, seeds of themes, of characters, of plots that will then be fully explored later on down the road. So if we think about, Beyond the Horizon, a quick plot summary, it focuses on two brothers, one of whom is an artist, is a poet and reads a lot. O'Neill does great things with stage directions about this brother, Robert, that he's thin in stature, he's a dreamer, and he has this ambition to go beyond the horizon. He wants to sail the world. He wants to, be on the sea. And his brother Andrew, who is much huskier as a man of the soil, is really meant to farm the family's estate. And there's a girl who lives next door, Ruth, who the family always sees as marrying Andrew and living on the farm. Well, in the first act, Ruth admits her love for Robert because she doesn't want him to go. And so we see a change. It's Andrew then who ends up going abroad, Robert who stays at the farm to be with Ruth, and disaster ensues because each son is doing really what he shouldn't be doing. So this idea of artists not following the path that they should, artists who are looking to do more commercial things, to make money, to have a family, to neglect their passion. That theme actually arose in earlier plays, one of which is called Bread and Butter, which was written in 1914, so a very early effort, some 6 years before Beyond the Horizon. So O'Neill was already, I think, at work on some of these themes which were going to occupy him for the rest of his career, even in those earlier works.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also in those plays this overarching sense of fate, and that no matter what human beings did, there was, so in that play too, just that it works out, as you said, disaster ensues, and in spite of their intentions, other things happen that are beyond their control. And you see those in a lot of the earlier plays too, where the characters at sea are trying to find their way home, and in spite of themselves, in spite of everything they do, they can't get there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's end this segment talking about Anna Christie, because that was his second Pulitzer Prize. I didn't know. I'm just looking at a bibliography. I didn't know he did a play called Chris Christopherson, but Anna Christie.
An early draft of Anna Christie.
Oh, it was?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was. The first draft, Chris Christopherson, is interesting because it was kind of a failure, actually, and they did tryouts in Boston and some maybe Philadelphia, anyway, outside of New York, and he. Chris Christopherson, the sailor, based on kind of a guy that O'Neill knew during his sailing days, was the center of the story in that play, and also the relationship with his daughter, who was a British typist, stenographer. And as he remakes it, this is really interesting, this insight into O'Neill, he remakes it and renames it Anna Christie. And her name is in quotes because that's her name when she was in the brothel, Anna Christopherson. So he kind of brings her down into the underworld, which a lot of artists were doing, right? If you think about George Bellows, he's painting the boxers,
Ashcan School of Painting.
Yeah.
Exactly, all the Ashcan folks, and John Sloan, who's drawing the hookers and the underworld. And so O'Neill makes the move to the other side of the Atlantic, And she's no longer a stenographer, but she's a recovering, trying to rehabilitate herself after being a prostitute, after being abandoned by her father. And her accent changes. She now has that kind of lower class slang with a tinge of the Swedish accent. It's really interesting how he makes it, and it's also one of the most sympathetic portraits of a prostitute, a woman down on her luck, who, by the way, does not die at the end, like Camille and all the rest of those characters, but she lives and she fights back and tells them all off for abandoning her and trying to own her body. And it's a wonderful, I think, and difficult to perform play. And so the ending, there was some controversy about it in terms of, is it a happy end? Is there ambiguity? And O'Neill defended the ending of the play with an essay to the New York Times where he said, listen, this is just a comma in the middle of a sentence. What happens after this is still yet to be seen, and the ambiguity is intentional. The film version in 1930 that featured Greta Garbo, it was her first speaking role, in my opinion, sort of ruined the ending of it because it was like a classical, Hollywood happy ending. O'Neill would have just turned in his grave had he seen it. So I think the challenge for people who do this play is to retain that haunting sense of, okay, it's over. It's not a sense of closure and everything's going to be okay. The story is yet to begin, in fact.
Where would you put the character of Anna Christie on a continuum from some of the early other modern female characters like Hedda Gabler or Nora from A Doll's House and some of Shaw's Major Barbara? Where would you put that on a continuum? Do you think that's a positive step or what?
I do, and that's what I write about, and we should include Kitty Warren from Mrs. Warren's Profession, the brothel madam, right? And so you hear traces of those characters, I think, in O'Neill, the very articulate way of talking about sexuality, but O'Neill makes it very, I think, real, where Shaw's is more, I think, in some ways academic, or certainly it sounds like they're debating, right? And you find that a little bit with Ibsen. And Anna Christie says, no one owns me, see? Nobody. And I'm not, you think I were a piece of furniture, and she throws a piece, a chair. So Nora's not going to do that. Kitty Warren's not going to do that. I think those playwrights were still adhering to the codes of decorum and propriety, and O'Neill just throws that out the door.
The Shaw character that might be an interesting comparison is actually Eliza Doolittle.
Yes.
Yeah, I've always I don't know how familiar you are with film in the middle of the 20th century, but I've always thought of O'Neill as sort of being the equivalent of the new wave of filmmakers of the 1960s, the theater like a half a century earlier. That the early modernists were sort of the Hitchcocks, and they were the Otto Premingers and whatnot, whereas O'Neill comes along and he's more of a Sam Peckinpah or someone from that came along in the 1960s, or maybe some of the great Japanese filmmakers, is that he digs a little bit more into the things that other people have, these other people presented things that were different, but they were still sort of dancing around some of the things, whereas O'Neill plunged headlong. I don't know if that's an apt comparison, but anyway, let's wrap up this segment, and then when we get back, let's start off with, I guess I would consider probably the era of his works from, say, Emperor Jones through Strange Interlude, which probably has a run of really terrific plays that most people, when they think of O'Neill, I think of some of those titles, and we'll do that in a moment. Well, let's in with what I call maybe the golden era of O'Neill, which I think a lot of people, and certainly I know when I was a kid and in English class, most of these were the titles that were the familiar ones, like The Emperor Jones, uh, Hairy Ape, Marco Millions, All God's Children Got Wing, Desire Under the Elms, The Great God Brown, Strange Interlude. Um, I always get the image of Paul Robeson whenever I just think of those titles. But let's start with the first one there, The Emperor Jones. And I know sometimes I get into arguments with people like who'll say, well, that's a really racist portrayal. And I say, well, that's just like people who say Abraham Lincoln was racist. Like, duh, he was born in the 19th century. The fact that he was able to free people who he didn't think was his equals is quite an accomplishment. And the same thing, in the same way, to me, O'Neill, yeah, the Emperor Jones in many ways is not a flattering portrait, but at least he's giving some inner life. He's giving some cogitation to a person that, yeah, he's not portrayed as, say, Paul Robeson would have been in real life, but there's something there that I don't know if there were even any playwrights of that era, but certainly no white playwright America had ever done. So what are your thoughts on the Emperor Jones and regarding race and the play itself?
Well, I've been writing this and teaching Emperor Jones and All God's Children, which were performed in repertoire actually when Paul Robeson took over the role. But one of the ways to think about O'Neill is the ways in which it is this play is contradictory. And it sort of cuts both ways, I think. In many ways, you're right. We can think of O'Neill as one of the first Black playwrights. And he was actually praised as such by some of the Black intelligentsia, Du Bois and Lester Walton and some of the African-American critics who were writing about the plays, though their stances would change actually over the years regarding it. And he wrote in Black vernacular, and so that that has been one of the most problematic aspects of the play, especially performing for modern audiences, because he also used the N-word, which some of the actors excised when they performed them. So the first actor, Charles Gilpin, when he was cast, he was one of the first Black actors in a white mainstream play. Even though it was at the Provincetown Playhouse, it moved uptown and had a quote-unquote Broadway run, as opposed to performing it in blackface, which was really the performance practice that dominated American performance. And really up through even the 50s and 60s, you would still find people in film and on stage in blackface. So that was a radical innovation, that he was a central character, that he was an emperor of power who was putting down his sidekick, Smithers. So for Charles Gilpin, who performed that role for many years, but after a couple of years, Paul Robeson took over the role. And virtually every great African-American actor performed that role. It was a way of moving forward and taking a substantive role in the theater that they could perform with integrity. And so many of them did do it. Robeson is a classic example, and they each remade it as they saw fit and toured with it. Jules Bledsoe would be another actor. Habib Benglia performed this role in Paris as an Algerian actor. So there was something that really drew these great actors to the role. And there's something yet problematic and with the language and some of the representations. But I think that tension, that contradiction is what makes it so interesting as a snapshot of American culture during the time.
Yeah, I would also just add that you know, this period we're starting to talk about now is this period of great experimentation for O'Neill, where he's really trying out all kinds of theatrical devices that his European counterparts have been playing with. So this is his Emperor Jones and the Hairy Ape are his main explorations of expressionism. And this is Emperor Jones is this great study of the human psyche. and he chooses to, as his everyman, he chooses an African American person, which is amazing. And all of the controversy around the language, he was depicting, you know, the one of the other great things about O'Neill was the way that he was able to capture. I mean, he's criticized by some critics like Mary McCarthy for being, you know, for his language not being eloquent, but he was a master of the vernacular. And, you know, his early plays, especially, all of the dialect and the accents and so forth. And that's what he's capturing here. He chose to focus this wonderful play on an African-American character, this expressionistic exploration. And he depicts an African-American in the vernacular that he heard around him at his time. So it's what Katie's saying, that, you know, that it's not O'Neill that's the racist. It was a racist culture that had these stereotypes.
And to add on in terms of the creation of these plays, here's where he is so fortunate to have the Provincetown Players as the production team, so to speak, for works like The Emperor Jones and The Harry VIII, because he is allowed this experimentation. And you know, Katie mentioned the editorial with Anna Christie. O'Neill actually had to write another editorial for The Harry VIII, you know, saying to audiences, this is expressionistic. You should not take this as realism, because his audiences, those who were encountering these experimental works, were still in that mindset of, you know, the plays he had seen previously. And so with these works, he's doing bold things, but he's with a theater company that's allowing him to do them. And yes, eventually they would get moved uptown, but it's very fortunate timing to be with the Provincetown Players at this point in this spirit of experimentation.
Yeah, I was going to ask, of the plays in that early 20s era, I'm looking Emperor Jones, Different, First Man, Harry VIII, The Fountain. The two that stick out, obviously the most famous ones, Emperor Jones and Harry VIII, the Harry VIII, yeah. And I was just wondering, how saturated do you think O'Neill was in Freudianism then? And do you think that that's been a thing that has been sort of a bugbear that's hung around, you know, is that sort of an albatross of that era? Because when I think of that, I also think of, speaking of films, when I look at the films of Alfred Hitchcock, for example, from the 40s and 50s, I mean, it's just so drenched in Freudianism. It's hard to take some of the characters' motivations seriously. And while I think I don't think, for example, those plays would hold up nearly as well if they were realistic. I think the expressionism sort of tamps down sort of the excesses of the Freudianism. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, the artists working at the first part of the 20th century, I don't think could escape Freud. Susan Glassville, O'Neill's contemporary in the Provincetown Players, has a great quote about living in the village in the 19-teens, that you could not go and buy a bun without hearing about Freud. You know, he was everywhere. So, you know, I think that although O'Neill certainly plays, and maybe with notions of Freud, and I think has some interesting opinions on this new fad of psychoanalysis, I just don't think there's an escape from it, because it was a new way of thinking, a new way of looking at how humans work, how we interact with each other. If we get to, you know, I think the play in which O'Neill is really dealing with some ideas of Freud is The Great God Brown, which is going to be another experimental play with masks and what faces we wear to the outer world and what face we wear to ourselves, or what is real. So I think the answer to your question is I don't think he or any really of the artists working at the time could escape these new ideas about the human psyche.
Go ahead, Stephen.
O'Neill denied the influence, but it was so evident. I mean, and in terms of the Greek play, The Desire Under the Elms, using the Greek model, I mean, it was clear that Freudian psychology is what replaced the Greek gods. I mean, it was psychological determinism that O'Neill was playing with, and the influence of Freud is just evident to anybody.
So would you say then that of those early plays, do you think those were the pivotal ones? Did they sort of well, by that time, I guess he had won a couple of Pulitzers, so he was already established as Eugene O'Neill. Do you think that then allowed him to go farther than he would have? Because it almost seems that because once he got more experimental as he got famous, almost as if he was, giving the finger to his father that I wasn't going to get trapped into your cycle of fame and renown, and he was going to always experiment. So do you think that he built upon his own renown and took that as sort of a validation to move even farther?
Perhaps. I mean, I think what's amazing about O'Neill is that really almost every play he's trying something new, So back to our previous conversation, he wrote sort of 3 African-American plays, or plays with 3 Black characters. And he sort of works through that. All God's Chillin'. He received death threats for portraying miscegenation, interracial desire. The KKK came and left calling cards, and he notoriously told them to get out of there. And so he did that. Done that. He did his expressionism in, let's say, 3 plays, right, or so. Emperor Jones, Harry Ape, and All God's Chillin', and then off. And then he starts mining that gold mine, really, of Freudian psychology, Desire Under the Elms, moving into Strange Interlude, and then he's experimenting with the interior monologue there. And it's just every single time people are like, what is O'Neill up to? He's sort of, well, maybe he's a little like Lady Gaga and constantly reinventing himself. And I suppose part of that is like, I'm really not doing my father's drama, but his dad was dead by then. And so he was, I think, just trying to, as an artist, I think, just really wanting to experiment and try new things. And that is what's so marvelous about him. He doesn't come back to high realism until the end of his career. And most people working in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
But we also shouldn't hide the fact that some of these experiments in this middle period were duds.
Yeah, they didn't all work.
I mean, but what's always important is he failed, but his reach was what was so important. And the fact, that he would pick himself up and do something different the next time, And,
Yes.
But they weren't all masterpieces.
What ones do you consider duds?
Lazarus Laughed.
Virtually unproducible.
Yeah, I mean, it has thousands of people, or hundreds of people on stage. I mean, it was, not.
I'm looking at the bibliography, and I see Marco. Okay, yeah, Marco Millions. It shows that it looks like it was started before All God's Children and then finished after. And I remember I had to read that in high school, but I can't for the life of me remember what it was about. Was that another dud, or?
Yeah, I think.
It's actually interesting in terms of some of what he was trying to say about capitalism and so forth. But as a piece of theater, I think it was pretty universally panned.
Yes.
Now, let's go on then to Desire Under the Elms, because that I remember when I read that was, for me, I don't know if that was his actual first experiment in reworking the Greek stuff, but I remember when I did read that and then later read the Electra trilogy, that's where even as a teenager I saw this is so far beyond what the Greeks were even capable of thinking. I know there have been people who've made thoughts that modern human thought, the modern human brain in just the last 1,000 years has gone far beyond what people in the BC era would have had. But I remember when I read that was such a step up from what I had read, in the anthologies of the old Greek plays. Was that his actual first reworking of Greek tragedy, and how successful do you think it was?
Well, I'll say it in terms, a reworking of a Greek tragedy, perhaps, but just to emphasize again, those in those earlier plays, O'Neill was a great admirer of Nietzsche, particularly, he's still attempting to do what he saw the Greeks do in their tragedies. In that same editorial I mentioned about the hairy ape, he actually says about that play that he was trying to attempt to build a tragedy as the Greeks understood it, that we shouldn't necessarily be sad and depressed with Yank's death at the end, because that really was the only path where he could go after a play of not belonging in various scenarios, and that we should be exalted watching him attempt to belong in these various worlds. So I would say the Greeks were with him early on. I mean, I think even the very first play that he did with the Provincetown Players, Bound East for Cardiff, same idea that we are to watch this friendship we have a dying sailor and his friend, and their final moments there, and it's a different kind of tragedy than certainly was on stages at that point, and one that went back to what he saw the Greeks doing. So I just would want to say that I think he was always having this idea of Greek tragedy even before, say, Desire of the Owls, which maybe resembles the structure of a Greek play.
Let's end this segment and talk about Strange Interlude, and that looks like that it was his third Pulitzer Prize. And then in our next segment, we'll talk about some of the Electra through Long Day's Journey and the big, huge ones that he's known for. Where would you put Strange Interlude if we look at that as maybe the end of that kind of era? Because that would have been his third Pulitzer. Do you think that that's a good place? Was that sort of a summing up until that point? Because it seemed to me then when he did the Electra trilogy a couple of years later, he was even more expansive. Because I mean, he was doing some of these long plays, but then he was doing like ultra long there.
Well, we could maybe tally this up to one of his failed experiments, I think, because he was trying to do what maybe Faulkner and some of the American playwrights were doing with these interior monologues, and it's almost one of these unproducible plays, right? It's about 5.5, 6 hours long. And so they, had this, when it was staged, they kept trying to get him to cut it. And he sort of held the line a little bit, and they had a dinner break when it was performed by the Theater Guild, I believe. And he was trying to articulate the interior thought patterns of, and psychology of characters, so they would kind of freeze. This is the acting sort of innovation as well. So he was often doing several things at once. They would freeze and kind of step out and direct those lines to the audience, and then they come back and do it again. So when I teach this, I often ask my students to try to stage these interior monologues, which are just kind of hokey, difficult to perform at the very least. And Groucho Marx famously parodied it, and there's a wonderful YouTube clip for your students who are watching this that where he's parodying this kind of very contrived performance practice. And so is it any wonder that very few theaters are doing it? I had the opportunity to see two productions. One was when the Goodman Theater did a sort of a retrospective of O'Neill's works, and the neo-futurists performed every single word. And it was brilliant, and it was very experimental. They did something very different for each 9 acts. So each act sort of corresponds to the cycle of giving birth to this new kind of drama here. And then I did see a whittled down sort of 2-hour version at the National Theatre in London a couple of years ago. And that worked too, though because it's so contrived, the performance practice, the audience kind of started laughing and nervously, not sure what to make of it. And I think that is a play that you sort of have to very carefully perform that practice and maybe sort of heighten it and parody it, for lack of a better word, almost as a historical piece, I would say.
I saw the Glenda Jackson production in, I forget when that was, in the 90s or 80s, and it was quite good. I mean, it was really good, and it somehow it wasn't that hokey. But I think that, I mean, it's a really interesting play, and the again, the female, the character of Nina is a really interesting character, and Dan, to go to, you've been referencing film. I think it anticipates film, the kind of the voiceover of films, and because it's, again, as Katie was saying, it's this, O'Neill was constantly trying to find a way to get that inner voice out on the stage in an era when realism was, was the mode, and how do you do that? And he tried it, and it kind of failed, but in some ways it kind of succeeded. I mean, it's an interesting play.
Yeah, well, I was thinking, because of some of those plays in the 20s, it anticipated for me some of the, I mentioned earlier, some of the films of the 1960s. I'm thinking specifically of Ingmar Bergman, who I think really, if you look at the films, rather, Bergman in the 1960s, things like Winter Light, if you've ever seen that, the Spider Trilogy plays, Persona, obviously. You have characters that are captured on film, and they're in very unnatural poses, and one character's talking and looking to the left, the other one's looking straight at the audience, another one's got their back turned, and it's so artificial, but yet you're getting inside the characters too. So I'm wondering, maybe if O'Neill had been born, 30, 40 years later, he might have become, a pre-Bergman as a filmmaker. But I had a point, but now I think I forgot it. Strange interlude. So with the staging of the play there too. So that was obviously before Thornton Wilder, because when you talk about hokey, I think sometimes of like when as a kid having to read Our Town, and not that it was a bad play, but it's sort of like comparing that to O'Neill, sort of like Little House on the Prairie compared to some a real drama, and that to me that's more hokey. I mean, with O'Neill, even if something failed, he's going to fail, but he's going to go down with the ship. He's going to be that Ahab going down with the ship.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. And I've taught Strange Interlude before. My students say if it's not done well, it becomes like a soap opera that you see on television today, where you have those interior monologues. But moving aside from the conventions in that play, and Steve touched on this, again, what's I think revolutionary about this play is we have this woman in the center of it, Nina Leeds, and she's, I think, a hotly debated character in terms of O'Neill's scholarship. Does she cause the destruction of the men around her, or is she a helping figure? So I think the fact that O'Neill is putting this woman in a strong woman at that, a smart woman, in the center of this massive drama is again another bold experiment for the time. So I would just mention that, and I think, like I said, she still is a figure that I think O'Neill scholars certainly wrestle with even today in terms of her place and what the kinds of things that she does. Is she forced into some of the decisions she makes? Is it free will? So there's a lot of interesting debate around her.
And talk about Freud. I mean,
yeah,
right.
This whole struggle between the conscious and the unconscious in that play, it's almost as if O'Neill was kind of putting Freud on the stage to parody it in a sense.
Yes.
Yeah. And he cites some, I think Jung is literally cited, isn't he? Back to Nina, this is the thing with O'Neill. He's difficult to locate. On the one hand, she's it's a very progressive, sort of radical portrait of a woman who is struggling with her sexuality and thinking about what it means to be a wife and to be a sexual being and to be a mother. On the other hand, he's really wrestling with some of the more traditional tropes about motherhood. And it's some of those lines that become kind of almost laughable, I think, unbelievable, I'll say, to some of our students. I must have my baby, she says, to, basically, that's also Freud, right? To complete my Oedipal cycle, I have to have a baby to become a complete person. And, that was true in 1928, I guess. But, I think not true of our time period. And yet, there she is at the center of this story. So it's a very, you can't ever locate O'Neill in a particular place. You sort of debate him and engage with him.
And that's where I think, there's been, and this is my own scholarship, I think early on, earlier scholarship on O'Neill kind of diminishes the women or says these women are shrews or harpies or they're the reason of the men's, downfall. But I think O'Neill is much more nuanced and complex than that. And the female characters are an embodiment of this complex thinking about how women operate in relationships, in the commercial world, in families. So, and I think, Nina is rich territory for those things. I will also say that there's, this line from Strange Interlude, which Katie, you might have a better quoting on it, but, she talks about how she's wife and lover and mother. And it's interesting because O'Neill actually is going to have a very similar description for his own third wife, Carlotta, in the dedication to Long Day's Journey into Night, he calls her, wife, mistress, mother. So the way that he sees women, or the way he creates women in his plays, I think in a lot of ways reflects his own thinking about the women in his life.
With Carlotta was getting started right at the time of Strange Interlude.
Yes, and so he sees this connection of women having all of these different roles, or what are the roles that they need to play in a marriage. We could do a whole nother conversation about O'Neill's relationship to women in his life, and how troubling it is at some points based on his relationship with his mother. He would lose his virginity to a prostitute. So these things would haunt him, not only in his writing but in his real life as well.
Well, women generally do get slagged on more than men. If you look at one of the great characters in literature, Don Quixote, the character's a total asshole. If it wasn't for Sancho Panza, But anyway, let's end this segment and then let's talk about the big plays of the 30s and 40s that probably, I guess he would still be considered a very good to great playwright if he hadn't done that. But this is sort of the thing that I guess most people look at him as an immortal, and we'll do that in just a bit. All right, so now this is sort of the meat of what most people would think of as primetime O'Neill, I guess, and I'm talking about the Electra trilogy, Morning Becomes Electra through Long Day's Journey into Night, and I also see Huey is in there too, and I remember reading that. So why don't, before we get to those sort of three big monolith plays, let's talk about some of like Days Without End, Our Wilderness, Huey, these smaller, lesser-known plays between Electra, Iceman, and Long Days. I'll just toss it out there. Any comments on some of these smaller works between these megalithic plays?
Well, you've got a lot in there that we would probably separate out, I think.
Well, that's just a comment or two of anything that they may have added to the canon or to his development.
Well, Our Wilderness comes between Morning Becomes Electra and the late great plays, and I think it's a seminal work. It's his own. Of course, it's not a Rolling in the Aisles comedy. It's, as I think John Gassner said, it's a simple domestic comedy, nothing less and nothing more. But it's, you talk Our Town. It's sort of O'Neill's Our Town, and as he talked of it as the childhood he wished he had. But I think that it's a crucial piece of work in his canon because it's the bridge between these experimental plays and the realistic late plays. Partly because he captures the humanity of these characters in a way that he wasn't capturing them in in even Morning Becomes Electra and Strange Interlude and the ones we've been talking about, that these characters, that there's something about the humor and the ability to laugh at themselves and the domestic trivialities of that play that he was then able to bring into the later plays that made them more realistic and more compelling and more resonant to the American audience, to the world audience. I think that's a crucial play.
How about Huey? I was just looking at it, and it looks almost like the plot to a minor film noir. What about Huey? Any comments on that?
Doesn't Huey become a film? Isn't there a film version of Huey?
It says Jason Robards produced one in '84.
Yeah, that does have some of those qualities. Yeah, Steve.
Well, because the night clerk's whole inner monologue,
yeah,
it's never it's in an inner monologue. It's Strange Interlude, but taken that's the character doesn't say very much, but there's this whole world that's not depicted that's begging to be put into a film. Mm-hmm. So, and I think there's something that O'Neill wrote somewhere that said that he imagined it being projected on the stage in a film version. While the other character is speaking, that you'd see the thinking of the night clerk.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it comes later. It's more contemporary with Iceman and Long Day's Journey and those plays that he's writing at Dow House. And part of a larger series of plays that he was imagining called By Way of Obit, which were going to be these little one-act obituaries. And it's also interesting that he returns to the one-act form, which is where he started. But Huey is a much more complex and interesting play than many of the early ones.
And I think it lends itself better to production than some of the, he's doing similar things maybe in Strange Interlude, but I've actually seen a few productions of Huey which stand up and work still very well. So
yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Let's take a step back then to Morning Becomes Electra, and we had mentioned Desire Under the Elms, and Morning Becomes Electra, if you take it as one work, sort of even dwarfs Desire Under the Elms. What was his impetus for that? Was it just to rework the Greek play, or did he add personal touches into it from his own, life and whatnot? Because that's quite an undertaking.
It's fascinating to teach and to also read Morning Becomes Electra next to the Oresteia. Which is how I teach it, and of course you have to devote a couple of weeks to do that because there are two trilogies, one by Aeschylus and obviously O'Neill, and if you draw the parallels really to the character, he is really rewriting the Oresteia. Agamemnon is this character, and Clytemnestra, etc. Even the chorus, what he does with the chorus and rewriting the Greeks is fascinating in that household. And so it remains to me one of my favorite O'Neill plays, not just because it is the Oresteia rewritten as an American tragedy, but because it gets at the heart of war-torn America. So he sets it back into the Civil War. He's writing it in the 20s, but what does he do? And O'Neill does this in several of his plays. He'll put it back in the 1910s, or in this case, the 19th century. He does that in Desire Under the Elms to gain that historical perspective, I think. And he also borrows from the Greeks, and he makes these characters so vibrant and alive. And he's also experimenting a little more with the notion of masks, not real masks, but thinking of the characters as having death masks, which he writes in his beautiful stage directions. I think that play is among his greatest works that still stands today. I'm surprised more people don't produce it. It's the length, I think, is quite a thing to stage.
I teach a course on the American dream and drama, and what I find interesting about when he's writing Morning Becomes Electra in 1920s, he's beginning this certainly before the market crashes, but if we think about the 20s, this is a very vibrant time, economic boom, self-made man, all of these kinds of notions. And it's at this point that O'Neill goes back to the Greeks, where many decisions are not left to us. That once something gets fate gets rolling, things are out of our control, which I think would be, and still is, and even for my students today, a hard pill to swallow in this idea that we create our own destiny, and there is no such thing as fate. So I think the very fact of when he goes back to the Greeks in terms of a historical context is very, very interesting. Coming out of the 20s, but then I think when Morning Becomes Electra is produced and into the 30s, it feels very appropriate. But I think the timing of when O'Neill decides to go back and recreate this Greek tragedy is pretty fascinating.
It's also really interesting, back to our shared interest in gender. When my students read the Oresteia, they often say, "What happens to Electra?" She kind of just goes poof. And the playwright is very much interested in Orestes, who becomes Oren in O'Neill's play. And what does O'Neill do? He makes her the center point of the story. He sort of realizes, I'm not going to make this about, the son and sort of the predictable kind of Oedipal story, which he's written amply about, by the way, but rather what would happen now if we pursue the Electra complex, which is another Freudian theme, and putting Electra back in the story to think about how would she avenge the tragedy that befell the family.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, this might be debatable, but by putting, and even the Clytemnestra character here, Christine, we get in some ways a more, this is going to sound odd, but sympathetic portrait, or understanding more where she comes from as opposed to what is in the original Oresteia. We get a fuller backing of that character. So it's really a delight to see the changes he makes from the female perspective. Absolutely.
And that is, if I recall, set during the Civil War, right? He brings it up to the Civil War.
Right.
Why do you think that he set that in the Civil War? Because that's sort of the closest we've got to sort of a Greek sundering, rather than make it a more modern. By then would have been 1920s. Do you think that was just the more fecund ground for him to reset it in?
I do. The Civil War was the war that broke the country in half, right? And it's similar to the Battle of Troy, right? And so I think rather than more fresh in people's memory, which was about different things and also not in our own country. It was not fought on our land. He wanted to bring that back home, the question of home, and in fact the trilogy is named The Haunted, The Homecoming. What's the other one?
Haunted, Homecoming.
The Haunted, The Haunted, and The Homecoming.
Yeah.
So let's move on then. The big two plays, The Iceman Cometh and A Long Day's Journey into Night. I know of the two of them, I always preferred Iceman Cometh, even though probably 80% would prefer A Long Day's Journey into Night, and it's probably because it is set with it's basically just I call it sort of like the death of testosterone play. It's sort of like you have these guys that if they had been in this bar 30 years early, they would have been talking about their conquests and this and that, but all of these are sort of sad sack characters. It reminds me, Jimmy Cagney did a film in the 1940s. I can't remember it, but it was set totally in a bar. I think it was based on a Broadway play, but it was a bit more upbeat. But it's just one of these things. If Rod Serling could have written that, except it doesn't have the nice twist ending at the end, unless you consider that everyone getting screwed is appropriate. But what prompted him to write a play, Iceman Cometh, which on its surface seems so dismal and so despairing? It reminds me of there was a film. I don't know if there was a Greek filmmaker who did a film called I forget the name of it, but it was about the Greek Civil War. That it's the open meadow something. But anyway, but it's one of those things that's a 3.5 hour film that it's great. It's a magnificent thing, but God, you have to be. I mean, you're just weeping at the end, and it's sort of like that. That's that way with Iceman Cometh. So anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, a couple of things that I mean, first of all, he was clearly this was one of his plays, that had been writing his whole life, and that he's going back to people that he knew. These are based on the characters that he crawled around in the pubs with, that he was hanging out with, and but again, it goes back to the vision that he has of the human condition, and again bringing it misses, I think, what the best productions find in this play, which is the great humor and spirit for life that these characters have, and it speaks to O'Neill's vision of the quest for something to give life meaning, and these characters have each other, and they have their pipe dreams, and so in the recent production at the Brooklyn Academy of Music with Nathan Lane and Brian Dennehy that was originally in Chicago, captured that so well. It was this ensemble of fascinating characters. One of the wonderful things of this play is that it is such a deep ensemble piece where each character has a story to tell, and each character is interesting, and each character gets its moment on the stage, gets his or her moment on the stage. So while it does have a despairing theme in some ways, and he himself didn't want it produced during the war because he felt it was too much of a downer for the audience.
Mm-hmm.
But yet, it also, as many of his others do, there's always this, in spite of the feeling of meaningless desire to.
It's also interesting, there's always a bit of biography in every play, right? So he's writing it towards the end of his life, and as with Long Day's Journey, he sets it back in time to this moment, 1910, I believe, when he was living in the lower Manhattan. He was visiting this place called the Hellhole, which as O'Neillians, we all visited the former site of the Hellhole when we had our conference there. And so he's contemplating that moment that Steve alluded to earlier, when that's where he tried to commit suicide. And so he is doing battle, or sort of working through those kind of his own demons as a young man, reflecting back in time.
Mm-hmm.
Was made into a film? Because I remember Robards was in that as well. But was that like in this? Was that maybe in the 70s that was made into a film, wasn't it?
It was earlier. Robert Redford was in that. Wow.
It's
Black and white.
Okay, because maybe I'm thinking of the PBS production of it with Robards in the 70s.
Yeah, that was filmed, yeah.
Yeah. So let's move on. I recently, just about a week or so ago, they have these new sub-channels. There's a sub-channel for, I think, the local Fox station here in Texas where I live, that's called movies.com or something. And I saw the 1962 film of A Long Day's Journey into Night with Katharine Hepburn and Ralph Richardson and Robards and Dean Stockwell as I guess he's the de facto O'Neill, Jamie O'Neill. And that's generally considered by most people his masterpiece. And it should be said that I think both Iceman and Long Days were after he won. That came after he won the Nobel, right?
Yes.
That was between Electra and Iceman. So
Electra was before.
Electra was before this.
Yeah. And so I don't think there was anything different in the film. It was directed by Kazan, I think. The film was it Kazan? No, or was it Lumet? Lumet, not Kazan.
Lumet.
And so why do you think that has had such a resonance, probably over all of his other plays? I mean, other than its quality, do you think that there's an every? I mean, it's hard to think of that as really as in every family, but is it really in every family? Do you think?
You know, I've taught this play to students ranging in age from 16 to graduate students. And you know, a comment that I think comes up in every class discussion in some way, a student will say something that this reminds me nothing of my family and completely of my family. So certainly the circumstances that the Tyrone family deal with maybe are unique to them, but what I think O'Neill does so well in that work, which really resonates with all of us, is capturing how these people communicate, or maybe the lack of communication. You know, something that I always emphasize with Long Day's Journey Tonight is how the family deals with the problems that are there, whether it is with alcoholism or drug use or you know, promiscuity, and the way that they talk to one another. You know, one character, particularly in Long Day's Journey Tonight, Jamie Tyrone, the older brother, very often will say these pretty horrific yet very honest statements and then retract and apologize and say, I didn't mean it. And it's those moments that, you know, my students and me as well can really resonate with. I mean, this is what happens in a family, right? This kind of walking on eggshells at certain points, depending on what the subject matter is. So again, I think what gives that play lasting power is not necessarily the particular problems, although drug use and alcoholism, of course, run rampant in many families, but the way that we watch these characters deal with what they're presented with, and the way they communicate with each other, the way they deal with hardships of the past, you know, and how those things of the past are now playing out in their present. I mean, those are the things that I think will be in families forever. I mean, so I think that's where this play has lasting power.
Yeah, you know, I agree with everything Beth said. I mean, he just captures the family dynamic so clearly. I mean, the whole notion of the children, the sons, you know, their struggle, the push-pull of being dependent and independent. I mean, that all children and parents go through. I mean, it's universal. And I go back also to the alcoholism and the pattern of denial and enabling, you know, which is consistent with alcoholic families, but you don't have to be alcoholic to be. Many families engage in those patterns, whether it's alcohol or not, of enabling some kind of behavior within the family, of having this whole system of guilt and blame, and this whole way in which memory works in that play. I mean, you know, I've certainly had it in my family where, you know, we all have a different memory of that event that happened 15, 20 years ago. Everybody's got a different version of it. Just like, you know, was James drunk? You know, did Mary find him drunk at the hotel door every night or not? You know, do they remember it different? What's the truth? And how to grasp onto that truth. And I think that's part of the identification that people have with it. It's just so real of how families deal and interact.
And the brilliance of his writing, you know, thinking back to that production I saw in 2001 in New York with those wonderful actors, and I happened to be seeing it with some old friends who I'd known since I was, you know, in high school, and we just all sat there and sobbed, and we all recognized parts of our family, and we all knew each other's families, and it was just one of those moments, as you both have said, where we saw aspects of our, you know, of our families, of the heartache, of the betrayals, the enabling, the love, also the profound love that's in that play, which is a complicated love that I think so many people identify with.
The one thing I want to add about both Iceman and Long Day's Journey is to go back to the alcohol again. We've been talking about how O'Neill has tried throughout his career to find a way to get the inner life onto the stage, and he experimented with all kinds of non-realistic devices. In these late plays, alcoholism becomes the realistic, and intoxication becomes the realistic device that enables characters to speak truth. All of the characters in Iceman and all of the characters in Long Day's Journey are either drunk through much of the play, or in Mary's case, on morphine. And I mean, Jamie says it, that he can talk to, he can tell Edmund the truth, in vino veritas.
Yes.
He's drunk enough to tell him. And that happens over and over again in these plays, where things come out. And you don't need the artificial asides or the masks anymore. It's real.
Mm-hmm. And to that, we should add Moon for the Misbegotten.
Yes.
Which I think is, it's a love letter to his father, or to his brother, Jamie. And similar thing, which that play breaks my heart every time I read it.
When Katie mentioned, the profound love that is in Long Day's Journey to Night, which I don't think people think about when they first think about that play, I do find a connection to A Moon for the Misbegotten. And I would argue that, O'Neill, and this is what he says in his dedication, he's grasping for an understanding of these characters. Why, and not the characters, family members. I mean, these are his family, his, real life mother and father on the stage, his brother. And I think in Long Day's Journey to Night and A Moon for the Misbegotten, love for O'Neill means a true understanding, getting to a place where maybe you don't agree, but you understand why the people in your life do the things they do. And I think throughout his career as a playwright, we see notions of this in his earlier plays, but with those two, Long Day's Journey and A Moon for the Misbegotten, I think he comes to his own realization that love and understanding are very intertwined, that you can't really have one without the other. And in those moments in Long Day's Journey to Night where we have Edmund, who is the Eugene O'Neill character, and we should mention that Eugene O'Neill takes on the name of his dead brother, Edmund. That's the character that he takes on in Long Day's Journey to Night. He has finally this moment with his father where he gets to hear where his father is coming from and why he is this miserly, penny-pinching person. And so we get this understanding, and then hopefully from that, a love. So I would just say in those two plays, I think those two are really intertwined.
Well, yeah, I was just looking up. It says that, and I've got Moon for the Misbegotten over here on my shelves. It's been many years since I read it, but it is a direct sequel, because the Jim Tyrone is Jamie Tyrone years later. And, it gets back to, I was thinking, I remember I read somewhere, a critic had written that Mary Tyrone was the Ahab of the Tyrone family, dragging them all down with him. And I always thought that was not so. And it wasn't because I had Moon for Misbegotten in my mind. It's that if I think of an Ahab kind of situation, that's Iceman. These characters are going down, and there's no depths from what they're going to come. But at the end of Long Day's Journey, when Mary gives her "and I met James Tyrone" little speech at the end, and Blackout, this is, to me, this is really Kafka, because you could go take a 5-minute interlude, come back from the bathroom, and start the play up again, because these characters have done the same thing over and over and over. And I don't know what the result of the other characters. I would assume Edmund died of TB or whatever he had, and isn't in Moon for the Misbegotten. It's been years since I read it, but I always got the idea that Iceman is pure declension. Long Day's Journey is a cycle, and it's just going to go on until each of the characters just drop off. So I've never thought of that, despite everyone saying how terrible it is. I always thought, when you talk about an average family, we all do those same things. Your mother says, "You didn't do this," and your sister says, "You did that," and you say, "Dad did that to me," and you say that over and over in subtly, slightly different ways, 5 or 10 years from now, until Dad dies and Mom dies, and these characters are doing the same thing. So I've never bought the idea that it was as depressing as a lot of people think it was, because these characters, in a sense, need this. I think they need that. Would you agree?
Well, you're back to the existentialism and the theater of the absurdity, how it it foreshadows theater of the absurd. I mean, think of Beckett Waiting for Godot. I mean,
Yeah.
the same thing happens over and over again, day after day.
Yeah.
And Long Day's Journey is a much longer and a different approach to that, but it's similar in some ways. That you're right, that this is it's a cycle that keeps going, that keeps on going. I would argue that Iceman is too. That those denizens of Harry Hope, they're going to keep going. They're going to do the same thing the next day as they did the day before. You know, and you know, it's Camus' myth of Sisyphus. You roll the boulder up the hill and get to the top, and it rolls back down, and you start all over again.
Well, let's just talk, since we've only got really 2 major plays left. Let's just finish this segment with Touch of the Poet and More Stately Mansions. Both of them, which again I have not read for many years, but what is their significance? Because they seem to be the coda, and it looks like there was Calms of Capricorn, but I have no idea what that was about. But let's just talk about the last plays here and end the segment on that. Go ahead, anyone on those?
Well, you know, Touch the Poet is interesting in terms of its work with memory, again, what we remember. You know, the Con Melody was, you know, a big war hero, or at least in his own mind, perhaps. You know, what I find interesting about that play is certainly, and this is what I'm working on, you know, the marriage in that play. You know, his wife does a lot to bolster these memories, and to, you know, she herself, you know, bolsters his own image of himself, which I think is actually pretty harmful because he doesn't have a realistic portrayal of things. It's, you know, his daughter that will have that more realistic view on things, but it's another family dynamic of memory and what is true themselves in order to higher times. So Touch the Poet, you know, and there's other things that certainly at work in that play, but I think the notions that began with pipe dreaming in Iceman certainly are extending here. O'Neill is still very interested in what are the things we tell ourselves in order to live our lives, you know, and that can extend certainly to, you know, characters who are in, say, like unhappy marriages. What do we tell ourselves? What are the memories we rely on in order to deal with the things that are, you know, impediments in our present day? So, you know, there certainly is that extension of those themes in Touch the Poet.
You know, in some ways it brings together Long Day's Journey and Iceman Come, because it's the family bar play.
Yes, indeed.
And it's important to say, though, that it was part of this cycle of plays that O'Neill was working on in the latter part of his life, the tale of self-possessed or self-dispossessed. That was going to be a 11, then I think a 14-play cycle that went from the mid-19th century through the current time to trace the Irish-American family in America. And, you know, More Stately Mansions and Touch of the Poet are the 2 that survived, but Touch of the Poet is the only one that really survived as O'Neill wrote it. But it has so much in common with the late masterpieces, with Long Day's Journey, Moon for the Misbegotten, and Iceman Coming, that it's very easy to group it with those plays for all the reasons that Beth is suggesting and more. That thematically, it's got so many of the same issues raised, the kinds of characters, and so forth.
It seems that long cycle must have influenced August Wilson with his plays set in each decade.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, don't need to get to do it.
Let's end this segment, and in our final big segment, let's talk about O'Neill today and into the 21st century, theater today, and his prospects for the future. And we'll do that in a moment. All right. Well, let's head into the 21st century here and talk about Eugene O'Neill today. And I'm sort of someone who, when I don't even watch the Tony Awards anymore or whatnot, because, you know, I don't want to see Spider-Man or Mickey Mouse or Captain Kangaroo or whatnot. what do you think the prospects for there being, or is there someone now who's a direct descendant of O'Neill, do you think? I mean, we've gone through the 70s with Equus and Peter Schaefer and the Sam Shepherds and the David Mamet's and whatnot. Who today do you think is sort of a lineal, or even not a lineal, maybe just a spiritual descendant of O'Neill in terms of pushing the boundaries, trying to do something different? You know, someone striving for, as one of you had said, not stage but drama, not theater but drama.
Well, the one that I'm sure we're all thinking of immediately, that self-consciously is that way, is Tony Kushner.
Yes, that's who I was going to say.
Who speaks of O'Neill as, you know, in those ways, and wrote a wonderful essay on O'Neill about how all of American drama since then, you know, owes itself to O'Neill, and he acknowledges that and he takes it on. But there are others too.
I think that in terms of you know, his brilliance, his innovation, and his poignancy, and as well as use of comedy. In addition to Kushner, I would add perhaps Susan Laurie Parks, who has won the Pulitzer, and I think she's won a MacArthur Foundation grant in terms of innovating, again, with a very stylized but highly, I would argue, poetic style, and just a wonderful ear, working also with the Greeks and some American classics. Her Red Letter Plays is a retelling of Hawthorne and some of the Greeks. So she, for me, is another person that I would add to Tony Kushner.
Yeah, I would also say someone who's doing, I think, interesting things with the Greeks is Sarah Rule, and also with some of the poetic sense. There's also written about the playwright Tracy Letts, particularly his big family play, August Osage County, which was produced a few years ago, and parallels between that and Long Day's Journey into Night, and what happens behind closed doors of a family coming together in crisis. Yeah, so I think, you know, all of these artists in some ways are maybe picking up the baton that, you know, O'Neill's is granting, and doing, you know, innovative new things as well. But but the playwrights that you had mentioned, Dan, before, Shepard and others, I mean, I think they all owe a debt of gratitude to O'Neill. You know, in my own work, and I know Steve knows this as well, you know, our quest of bringing O'Neill into the high school classroom and educating the next generation of students on O'Neill. O'Neill generally is not really taught in secondary school classrooms. It's really Miller and Williams, who I think a lot of us would argue would not be who they are without the innovations that O'Neill brought to the stage. And, you know, one anecdote that I have in the work that I have done at Dow House, the national park site dedicated to O'Neill, there is a high school that is less than a mile from Dow House, right down the hill. And I've worked with students from that high school who say they never have read any O'Neill in a high school that is less than a mile from where O'Neill wrote his greatest plays. So, you know, that's, I think, something that's become kind of a quest for us all, is finding ways to make O'Neill accessible and put him back in the curriculum, along with Miller and Williams, who I think are much more the playwrights that teachers tend to gravitate toward when creating syllabi and things of that sort.
I'm afraid to say there are some college courses on American literature that don't include O'Neill.
Yes.
Well, is that because of the work itself, or is it because O'Neill was a white male and he wasn't gay and he wasn't a Jew?
Well, I mean, I think one prediction, and I've had this, I've heard this from teachers. I think O'Neill can be daunting. I think, looking at a play like Iceman Cometh or Morning Becomes Electra, I mean, these are massive plays, which I think there's a scare factor there. What we've tried to do, certainly in the O'Neill Society, is promote, a number of plays that maybe aren't as well known. I mean, I have had great luck teaching the one acts of O'Neill, even though early one acts. Number one, they're a little bit more in bite-sized pieces, but there's so much material to mine there, even in the one act plays. And then you can bring students to the bigger works and they're ready for it. So my experience, I think, is that there's this perception of O'Neill that he's dark and depressing and I don't want to, and difficult. But really, there's so much light in O'Neill, and there's so much richness there that I have found to be just wonderful material for incredible discussions in the classroom.
Well, I would think directors would find a lot of ways to bring O'Neill, sort of into the next century. I mean, his plays, I think, are very much director friendly. I don't know if there's such a term, but with critics, has he gone on the typical up and down roller coaster? If we talk about race or issues of sex, gender, I mean, he never did a play about homosexuality, did he? I mean,
well, Strange Interlude actually, it deals with homosexuality. I'm trying to think if there's others.
Well, I think one can always sort of look for the lavender traces, as we say, But so as the performance review editor for the Eugene O'Neill Review, one of the things I've been noticing this past year is how much O'Neill is being produced all over the globe, and we've really tried to reach out to get those pieces reviewed. And we're talking in South Africa, Cape Town, Desire Under the Elms, and we had a production of Long Day's Journey into Night in Spain, and we had a production in Anna Christie in Paris. And I mean, really everywhere in different languages being performed. O'Neill, the Hairy Apes being performed right now in London. So why is that? Part of it is the centennial of his time in Provincetown and sort of being launched into American theater. But that speaks to his appeal and the enduring quality of his work across cultures. So the conversation right now is very much about transnational O'Neill and O'Neill in international context and the appeal. How do you make your intervention as you direct O'Neill? Maybe you want to look at Marsden, that's the character in Strange Interlude, and we always have this debate in my class: is he gay? And most students will be like, yes, of course. Or how does Cape Town grapple with issues of race in their productions? Or in Australia, the Australian Long Day's Journey. So how does that speak to their own cultural moment through this American playwright? I think that's the fascinating question right now.
But of course, he's always been appreciated outside of the United States more than in our country, in many ways. And it's I think the challenge is getting him produced and taught here in our country and appreciated. And I think again it goes back to this perception of him as dark and depressing and difficult and long, and that impression, I think, puts people off, and we've just got to do what we can to fight that, and the best way to do it is through productions. And fortunately, there are more and more productions, but that's another challenge, because so many of O'Neill's plays are challenging for commercial theaters to produce. And when you talk about, though, I want to just say about the modern twist on things and how directors are playing with it. One group that you mentioned before, Katie, the neo-futurists, their stage direction thing is fascinating. They've done, and the director of that is committed to doing the whole canon of just O'Neill's stage directions. And they've started with the early plays. and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful piece of theater, both for O'Neill, people who appreciate O'Neill, but also for people who know nothing about O'Neill. And it could be an inroad into O'Neill for younger people who will find this really interesting performance art as a way to kind of then, oh, maybe I should read the whole play, and not just the stage direction.
Well, you can always go wrong, because I remember I once saw a production of King Lear, and when Lear's wandering on the heath, for some reason they had the fool be naked, and instead of being, he was joyous and whatnot, but I mean, he was wet on the heath, and he had shrinkage problems, and throughout the whole play you couldn't get that out of your mind. But
kind of the Darcy moment, the emerging from the water. Everyone's still talking about that.
Yeah. O'Neill, in terms of the democratization, we talked about being the first to have black characters. Was Lorraine Hansberry the first black playwright that got produced on Broadway? And is there any linkage between some of the characters, whether they're female? I mean, does O'Neill have any lineage into the Hansberrys and then the August Wilsons, or from any of the female playwrights that came later too, would you say?
Well, I mean, you could go back to, first of all, African American writers were writing and performing, in the 19th century, if not before. And one of the things that I'm writing about right now is how do we incorporate that into our scholarship? So if the way we talk about it is, were they on Broadway? Then the answer is going to be no. But if we widen our scope and say, did they have a competing theater, and were they performing, let's say, in Harlem, then the answer would be yes. And we would look at the Lafayette Players, and Robeson and Gilpin, and all those people were performing sometimes the exact same plays and doing some of the roles in whiteface. And then they would skip on their downtown, and they would perform lesser roles on Broadway if they were lucky, or just, and the same would be true for film. They would work with race film directors and have meaty, wonderful roles, but then they would kind of, if they got cast into Hollywood films, they would do these, minor roles, if at all. So I think the story we have to ask is, are we looking in the right places, and have we written enough about the artistry of all kinds of actors and playwrights who were writing and who were performing, but in different places than we might suspect.
Well, let's bring this to a close, and let me give each of the three of you, any closing statements you want about anything you have coming up yourself, if you're producing any plays or anything, and any comments about O'Neill. So, Stephen, why don't you take us out, and what have you got coming up, or any final comments on O'Neill?
Well, one thing I'll say, because I neglected to say it in my opening remarks, which when I talked about how I came to O'Neill through this work on Albany and through my graduate work, my dissertation, it was at that time that I started to go to O'Neill Plays, and that's really what hooked me. Once I started to sit in the theater with O'Neill, there are very few more powerful experiences, and I think that's important. I mean, O'Neill gets criticized sometimes as a literary figure, and that's sometimes maybe why he's not included in some literature courses, because some people don't consider his work literary. He's criticized for not being as literary a writer. But as a dramatist, as an artist of the theater, he's unmatched. I mean, the power, and so many actors and directors speak of this, that when you're involved in an O'Neill play, you get swept away in the power of his theater. And the way he wrote for theater is just unmatched consistently in all these experiments that we've talked about throughout his career, in the different ways that he did it. And of course, in those late masterpieces, the power of it is just unmatched. So I think that that's really important, and that's why productions are so important, to get people into the theater to experience O'Neill. And some of it can be reproduced on film and tape, and those are good too. But you've got to see it performed.
Yeah, I agree.
the other thing I'll just say personally is that what I'm working on, and I'll have to give you the brief version, are these photographs that a man who is the great nephew of the woman who worked for O'Neill when he lived in Marblehead, Massachusetts, towards the end of his life, worked for O'Neill and for Eugene and Carlotta, called me some time ago and had found some photographs in his uncle's storage bin which belonged to the O'Neills from that house in Marblehead. And they're wonderful photographs. Some of them we've seen before, but some appear to be originals of O'Neill and Carlotta, mostly in their time at Sea Island, Georgia, when they lived there, and in the 20s, and then there are also some. I'm sorry, in the 30s, and there are also some pictures that belong to them that are of members of the Moscow Art Theater and other. There's 2 signed ones from Rosalind Russell and 1 signed photograph from Olga Knipper Chekhov's wife, to Carlotta. So it's a really interesting collection of photographs that I'm hoping to do more with and eventually make available to other scholars at one of the collections here in possibly at Yale or somewhere else.
Yeah, I think I agree with you about the performance. People forget that. I don't see how anyone with a brain could say that the writing is not literary in the sense. I mean,
right.
Yeah, there is a difference. I know when I like reading the plays, and then when I see performance, I always know it's going to be different. It's not quite the same as like a screenplay versus a film, because a screenplay is never completely finished, whereas a play actually is. But I agree. Katie, how about you?
I would say to your listeners, go see O'Neill, produce O'Neill, read O'Neill. Personally, I just came out with a collection of plays about prostitution, and in there is O'Neill's 1 act called The Web, which features a hooker with a heart of gold kind of character who has TB, tuberculosis, which he wrote when he had tuberculosis. So it's very producible and wonderful, so people could look at that. And I just launched a website called Prostitution and Brothel Drama in the Progressive Era, and there are some links to contemporary productions of O'Neill and some historical context about prostitution and theater and film during this time period. So my hope is that it becomes a bit of a digital archive for students and scholars and practitioners alike.
Well, do me a favor, once we're done with this, just send me an email with the link to that, because I'll link it along with all 3 of your pages for people to look at for further information, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Beth, how about you?
Well, I'm going to echo Katie and Steve in terms of seeing O'Neill, and a production that has just been announced that we're all very excited about is another Broadway production of Long Day's Journey into Night, coming the spring of 2016, starring Jessica Lange and Gabrielle Byrne. So I think that's going to be a very highly anticipated, exciting production. And I think I would also just add, especially to your students who are listening, you read O'Neill out loud. If you're assigned a play for a class, get together with a friend and read it out loud, and it will be, I think, completely life-changing. I always have students, for instance, we read the opening of The Hairy Ape, where all of the sailors are speaking at once and swearing and singing, and it's a completely different experience than just reading it. So as you are reading it, remember that it is meant to be on its feet, it's meant to be on the stage, and read it out loud. It gives it a whole new spin. Personally, yes, I've talked about my book on marriage. I'll just say that the things that I'm finding with O'Neill's own thoughts and musings about marriage that come out in his plays are very, very modern and ahead of their time. The time that he was writing, the idea of entering into a marriage without really knowing your partner in various ways was not only common, but actually celebrated in popular magazines and advice columns. And O'Neill really demonstrates in his plays the very, very painful ramifications that can happen when you do enter into a partnership with someone you don't fully know or understand. So I'm hoping that book will be out in not too far in the future, but that's my project now.
Okay, well, I want to thank all three of you for talking about Eugene O'Neill. If I could have gotten one director to direct anything by Eugene O'Neill, it would have been Orson Welles, because I can tell you, if you look online on YouTube, there's a film he did in the late '60s called Falstaff, where he took the 4 or 5 appearances of Falstaff in Shakespeare's plays, added some stuff to it, and wove it into a great film. I'm not a big fan of Shakespeare's comedies, and Falstaff I've never liked, but Wells was brilliant, and I could imagine if Wells ever had gotten the backing of Hollywood and dug into some of this material, because you look at some of the stuff he did with Shakespeare. Wells, I think, my own opinion, would have been made for O'Neill. And for you people, I'll recommend, if you really want to find someone who's doing O'Neill-like drama, there's a Turkish filmmaker named Nuri Bilge Ceylan. I just watched a film of his called Winter Sleep. It's a little over 3 hours long. It's about a family coming apart, and he also has another film called Climates that's terrific, about a marriage disintegrating. And he's, I think, the best filmmaker in the world going right now. Him or Steve McQueen, arguably. But anyway, thanks again. And for anyone watching, next week we're going to go from Eugene O'Neill to another titan, Stanley Kubrick, in film. So be there for that. So again, thank you all.